guys, and welcome back to another episode of the ADH Dads. I'm your host, CJ,
I'm JJ.
and today we have a very special guest. His name is Sanjay Nambiar. Did I say that right, brother?
Both work. I'll take either. As long as someone's calling me.
All right. I grew up with the name Colton, and people never seem to get it right. It was always Colin, Cotton, Carlton, so I got a lot of interesting iterations of it. So that's why I go by CJ on this show. But welcome, Sanjay. I'm very glad to have you. You grew up in Compton, California, which seems like a very interesting story that I really want to hear more about. And you come from a background of investment banking as well as business development. You work in production. You're an author of 5 award-winning children's books, and you've got your own publication company. So I'm interested to talk to you today and see how life has taken you through all these different journeys, and why you're here today, and you're celebrating these Zen principles and female empowerment through your books for your twin daughters, and now you do men's coaching and help them on midlife crisis and dealing with life transitions. So I'm interested to see, how did you do that, brother? Tell us your story. How are you doing? Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I mean, you guys are doing such great work, such important work. So I'm psyched to be here today.
Well, thank you, man. Yeah, I always love meeting guys like you that just want to put good out into the world. And, I feel like we weren't really taught to be, at least in my experience, from the generation of men that came before us, didn't really have an intentionality about them and how to navigate with integrity and grace all the obstacles and triumphs that come about in life. Mm-hmm. So when I kind of found this path and started doing this with JJ, it just spoke to my heart. And, I always like hearing other men like you and why it speaks to yours and what brought you into this space, because I do feel like this is important work and we need more of it. And I'm glad to see that we're having more of it in today's day and age with platforms like podcasts and the internet and all that stuff. So how did you get into the space, brother? How did you go from investment banking, JP Morgan, and business development into Zen mindsets and female empowerment for men in midlife crisis?
Yeah, it definitely wasn't a linear path. Let's put it that way. But I've always been a little bit left and right brain. So I love the creative side and I love the kind of analytical side as well. So for better or worse, I was able to do both. And sometimes that was a little bit distracting. But once I got older and was more comfortable with who I was and more empowered, I was able to focus on what I really wanted to do and what I found meaningful and purposeful in life, right? I mean, investment banking was me. I mean, I did it in my 20s. I was out of college. An amazing skill set. You're also working like 100 hours a week. So you're basically getting double the amount of experience in the same amount of time. But the culture who've stayed there and are managing directors and partners and have done really, really well. But for me personally, it wasn't a fit. I always wanted to impact people more directly, and I wanted to have more creativity in my work. So after that, I worked in the .com. This is in the late 90s, so .com era music. So I'm a huge music head, and I've always been into the arts. So I worked at a place called Listen.com, then went to business school and did that. But after that, I kind of veered into things that I was finding more impactful on an individual basis, but also on a social level. I have my kids, they're 17 years old now, and that was kind of the inspiration behind my children's books. So I have one series called A Little Zen for Little Ones. There are 3 books in that series. It's basically taking old Zen fables, which are really beautiful, and contextualizing them for today's kids. There's a very famous story about 2 monks and a princess who's not that nice to them. And, basically one of the monks says to the other one, like, why are you still carrying her 2 minutes ago or 2 hours ago? So that whole idea. So I basically took those types of stories, but made them more modern. So instead of 2 monks, like kids today don't know what a monk or a farm is, right? Like the closest they get to a farm is Whole Foods. They have no, it's just a different world. So instead of 2 monks, it's like 2 little boys. And instead of a princess, it's like a girl on the playground. So things like that. Instead of horses, it's a bike, so that kids can still get the same messaging, but in a context and in a structure that makes sense to them. And then the other series is called The Super Amazing Princess Heroes. And so those basically regular girls who transform into princesses and they have superpowers. And the first book, they save the prince. So kind of subverting the princess paradigm. And I wrote these about
I
10,
love
12
that.
years ago. They released the first book. And back then, there wasn't a lot of literature that was really focused on female empowerment, especially in the picture book genre. So really, I wanted my kids to learn about something that was about them. There wasn't a lot out there. I think that the industry, the market has changed and evolved since then, which is a beautiful thing. But there are two books in that series. I've been working with other showrunners and TV writers trying to make that into an animated series, but Hollywood is insane. So that's a long journey in and of itself. But all that stuff
Hollywood is insane,
came to
brother.
coaching
Yeah.
eventually, because that was part of like what I did
Yeah.
always along the way, was focusing on helping people lead better lives and seeing different perspectives. That's always been a big thing of everything I've done.
I love hearing you say that because it reminds me of when I made a big transition from Hollywood and production into
Mhm.
this work from home space and podcasting and stuff. One of the big things for me is realizing like why I wanted to be a part of that production. And they kind of say like, be careful what you wish for, you just might get it, and that was like the case of like after 15 years of working in Hollywood in production, both in front of the camera, behind the camera, writing shows and performing shows. I realized like the little boy, the little damaged boy that needed this therapy, to realize that like he wanted this attention that he wasn't getting and was wanting from this outside world. And once I got into this family here and as a stepdad and started really like realizing the impact that I was making just on in the household level, just being around these kids, being intentional with them, it was like I got the greatest audience that I could ever hope for. Like, fuck Madison Square Garden or selling out some crowd like that doing stand-up comedy. Like, I've got the best laughs in the house right here, like front row center on the living room floor every night. And what the why behind that was so much more impactful and meaningful than like trying to chase 70, 80 hours in a production lot, with people that that are going to forget you for the next job, and it's feast or famine. And it was just kind of this realization of like, wow, like there's so much more important things out there, and I can make such a bigger difference on such a micro scale,
Mhm.
by but that little micro scale can turn into just what I believe is such a macro why and inspiration and motivation to keep going, which is like impacting the lives of these kids and the next generation, and further men and other families. So I appreciate to hear your call to your passion and how it's personal to you and how you wanted to make that difference, and empower your daughters too, who are now growing up. And love to hear that, brother.
Yeah, it's interesting. I lost my dad when I was very young, when I was like 5 years old. So I was raised by a single mom. I have an older brother that I'm very close to, who's about now. There was a lot of trauma that I kind of reconciled and did a ton of therapy in my 20s and 30s and my 40s. I'll be 50 in July, getting up there. So, but it's interesting. I was always more attuned to kind of like the feminine side because I was raised by a single mom, and like therapy always made so much sense to me. Like I think it's profound and transformative, but there are limits to therapy. I mean, I've done it for 20, 30 years. I can see where it kind of stops. It's retrospective and understanding why we are now, but how is it prescriptive? Those kind of inherent elements. What was really interesting though is when I started looking at my buddies. So I went to good colleges, good grad schools, whatever, and these guys are like crushing it, just making tons and tons of money, and they've got the big houses and the vacations and the cars. And when we were able to sit and actually be vulnerable, either over a glass of wine or hanging out playing golf, whatever, and if they were able to be a little candid, there was just universal disaffection, universal unhappiness, boredom, lack of motivation, a lot of bad habits, lacking a sense of meaning, lacking a sense of purpose, giant disconnect I kept seeing over and over and over again with men between say 30 and 60 in that kind of sweet spot. Kind of not the cliche of the midlife crisis, but more life is evolving, our culture is evolving, and all these guys who on paper are quote unquote succeeding are not living fulfilled lives and are really frustrated and they don't know where to go. They don't tend to do therapy the same way women do. And these are generalities, right? But women typically, or you see this a lot, will be on a 20-minute commute to work with their girlfriends and talk about their sex lives, talk about their husbands, talk about their career, all these like hopes and dreams. men will be 6 hours on a golf cart on a weekend and we'll learn about their new set of clubs, their new putter. It just, guys typically don't go there. Again, generalities. But for guys who are in that kind of general description, then where is their safe space? Like, where are they able to be vulnerable, to really contemplate, consider challenging things in their lives, challenging decisions, unraveling, reconciling, trauma and past histories? If they're not doing therapy and they don't have a place to be, to have those intimate conversations of what do they do? That's really challenging. Ironically, it's hard for men these days, even though we've been in power for millennia. We're coming to a time it's like they're actually suffering.
Man, go ahead, JJ. Because I'm going to ramble for a long time, so I'll let you talk first, brother, because I get something to say about that as well.
You usually don't say a word on these podcasts. It's usually just me talking. No, I actually had a question about that. It's interesting to suggest men have kind of a way to almost suppress everything, and then they find out themselves they're in an unhappy place. Where do we identify that? I know you said you've always had this left right brain. You've seen friends who kind of stay in banking, and then you had this greater calling. What do you see as the common story that men tell themselves and maybe tell you when they've gotten to this point where they realize I have suppressed so much for so long and now I find myself uncertain of how to move forward?
A lot of it is socialization. It's our culture, and it's not just like United States culture. I see this internationally and with different religions, different race, different socioeconomic levels. It's pretty universal. I mean, I think part of it may be genetic as well. The genders are just wired a little bit differently. But for men, so much of our lives, we are compelled to define success in one dimension, right? Success is going to be usually financial wealth. So we're geared towards that. And if you go evolutionarily, like we're focused on like hunting, so we're focused on success and that's it. But it's only one dimension. And we are not often allowed to contemplate like failure. We're not allowed to be vulnerable. Our culture keeps telling like this man should look like. This is how a man should behave. This is how a dad should behave, a husband should behave. But the reality is life is very different and very nuanced and very complex. I find men sometimes they identify, right? Either they see their marriages aren't doing well, or parenting is overwhelming, or they're bored at work and there's an inflection point, or something happens at work and they need to look for a new career. Whenever you see that kind of triggered, sometimes they sit back and it's like, how did I get here? Like, what do I want to do with the next 20, 30, 40 years of my life?
So is it something like where they find a success in one area and now they're trying to apply that to all the different areas that are, essentially challenging their belief system, or, what looks like success in family life, or, something thereof?
Yeah, and sometimes we do things that are very ad hoc and with inertia, right? So we were in our careers for a very long time, and I've always said this to my clients. It's really funny. We get all this training through school and grad school and everything to learn like subjects and to learn stuff that's going to help us out on the job. We get so much training in our work, right? Whether we're going through a mission pro self, we get training in every aspect of life. We're playing sport, we're tennis, golf, basketball. We have coaches, we have trainers. We always get training. The two things we don't get training on are relationships/marriage and parenting. No one trains us on this. And I find that so bizarre. The two most important things in life that we are taught, we're assumed to be intuitive, and they're not. It's psychology, it's communication, it's a skill set. I think marriage is a skill set like anything else. Parenting is a skill set like anything else. And we have to learn that skill set either from other people or from reading or podcasts like yours. We have to learn how to do that. It's not intuitive. Or otherwise we just end up mimicking what we've seen, which happens to be our parents. And that's complicated too. That's there's good and bad in there.
I wonder what is the apprehension from. Do you think it takes like a big curveball out of left field, or a crisis, or a depleting of marriage for most of us men to come to this realization?
Sometimes there's something, there's like an epiphany or a crisis like that. There's like a big moment, a trigger. But I also often see men who are just like, there's like this ennui, there's this boredom, like it's been going on for a while and they're kind of sick of it, right? They've hit their threshold, they're not tolerating anymore. And they're sitting there at home. It's like, again, lack of meaning, lack of purpose. They're asking themselves, like, what the hell am I doing? Right. especially if they're not connecting with their partners or their wives, especially if they don't really care about work anymore. They're lacking motivation. They look back in their 20s when they were excited and things were new, like, why don't I have that anymore? Right. And then when they're able, a lot of, again, comes back, I think, to this allowance. Like, it depends, like, because men sometimes don't give themselves that space to be vulnerable, to be candid, to explore the hurt and the pain, the suffering, which is a very intimate thing to do. And if they don't allow themselves, then, often the solution is escape. We see that escape with alcohol, with porn, with drugs, with, like, it's a way to increase dopamine, to escape and to feel good temporarily. But we know, there are consequences to that, right? Those habits can be destructive. But when they have the ability, or someone in their life says, hey, you should talk to someone, or they realize, I just don't want to do this anymore, and they reach out to a therapist, they reach out to a coach, they reach out to, with self-help, then that starts a whole new journey, which can, that's transformative.
Yeah, I think we're at a kind of interesting crossroads with this kind of talk and this discussion, because the expectations of men and our role in society really have changed over the last 10 years. We're expected to have more of an emotional intelligence about us, and and a lot has changed. And I find, talking to the older generation, aka like my dad and that kind of generation, there's, I've done all of this work to kind of arm myself with, a different way of parenting than the way that I've been brought up. And I often hear my dad say in a lot of conversations, like, boy, when we were kids, that would have never happened. Or, when I was kids, this is how it happens. He's just very much stuck in the mentality of those societal pressures and definitions that have been placed on him, and I do kind of remember growing up and feeling a lot of I don't know if I agree with that, and as I've kind of gotten older and honed in my parenting style and who I want to, present to the external world as who I am as a man, I think that maybe my dad can have these moments, these aha epiphanies of oh wow, he's doing it differently, and congratulations. But I find that some men, maybe it's a generational thing, but I do feel that maybe we are on the cusps of maybe changing how we feel, but there is just that kind of maybe that lag period of accepting change, wanting to change, because I see it in my dad and so many other men of well, I'm too old and this is it, and I've essentially learned all I've wanted to learn. This is the mode of operation, and this is the comfortability that I'm willing to accept, in life. And how do we challenge that? What questions do we ask to say is this really the best or the comfort, or are you willing to challenge yourself by asking different questions? And if so, how do we gain that mindset in most people to kind of open them up to what those questions may be?
It's interesting. What you say is very insightful. And I feel like, change is hard. Change is really, really, and we've changed more in the past 30 years, culturally, socially, than the past 2 millennia. And I think in beautiful, wonderful ways. And I have 2 daughters. Our roles were so structured before. We knew exactly what the guy was going to do, exactly what the wife was going to do in a typical hetero relationship. And it's that's changed, because now women out earn men in so many cases, have more education. College campuses are far more skewed towards women. It's over 50%. It's 50 to 55 is the average. So our culture is changing. It's evolving. I think that's beautiful. It's wonderful. But for a lot of people, change is hard. What they're familiar with, what they used to get their sense of power from, is now kind of evaporating. And when it's new, it can be very threatening. And I have compassion for that. That's really hard. I think what's interesting, though, cultural kind of social change, emotional change is much harder, because we see change all the time. Playing tennis, no one's sitting there, oh man, I wish we had wooden rackets again. It's no, they like the new technology. They can hit the ball harder with more topspin, and it's that's great. So we accept change in other contexts and other dynamics. Can I be a stay-at-home dad? Can I go to therapists? Can I talk about these things that are really hard and make me seem quote unquote weak? That was always been the definition, when actually there's strength there. It's really hard to evolve in that way. You're asking, CJ, the questions to ask. I always put that it's work. If you're willing to put in the work and willing to learn about it and explore, you can change. Otherwise, you're not going to change, right? for guys, I give the best examples, like sports metaphors tend to work really well with men, depending on like they played sports. Like for golf, like if someone sits there and goes, I want to be a better golfer, right? Great. But if you don't go to the range and you don't get instruction and you don't work at your game, you're never going to be better. It doesn't work that way, right? If we want to be healthier, we have to change our nutrition and we have to exercise more. Everything is the result of work. If we don't put the work in, there's no outcome, right? But for some reason, we're like, I want to have a better career. I want to be happier. I want to be more fulfilled. I want to have more meaning. And it stops there. If we want those things, we have to put the work in. So realizing that and asking those questions, if they're willing to do the work, and if you really want this transformation, you want this change, absolutely it's possible, right? That's a beautiful journey, and it evolves and it changes and it winds and it can go in places we can't even anticipate, but it doesn't happen at all. Otherwise you stay in that inertia and that rut if you don't put the work in.
What's the saying, JJ? Change happens one of two ways, either intentional pain or unintentional pain.
Right.
It's like what we're saying, it's either something crisis, something happens, our marriage falls apart, kids don't want to talk to us, we lose a job or lose the house or something like that, and you have to reevaluate everything. Or you make the steps, you structure what the work looks like, and you make the effort every day intentionally. But either way, it's going to be hard. You got to choose your pain, you got to choose which hard it's going to be.
Yeah, and I've also heard, the idea that every choice brings you closer or further to your goal, or further from or closer to your goal. Well, one thing I do kind of it made me chuckle earlier is when you talked about the idea of having to move forward, and it's funny to me that when you're going to have a child, there's certain classes that you can take and to help prepare you, but nothing fully prepares you. You got to continue to work hard at it. And then when you think about marriage, and I had to take, I think it was like 8 weeks of marriage, we'll call it counseling, before getting married. That really that's really not even striking the surface, honestly. That's just looking at it from from the level of the clouds. At that point, we've hardly even scratched anything. Yet here we are, we dive into it. And I think one thing that I've heard too many men speak on is that they wish they could go back to the way things were, which is a suggestion of an impossibility, because we don't go back to something that wasn't the full picture. We started to go through the process of growth and understanding our true selves when we're faced with adversity, we're faced with, the real challenges of marriage. And getting this thought in your head, I wish things would go back to the way they were, is the complete rejection of the idea of moving forward, like you've been saying.
It's really funny that you say that, and I love that concept. There's one of my favorite quotes. I mean, spiritual, religious beliefs notwithstanding, one of my favorite quotes is from the Buddha, and he says that the root of all suffering is wanting things to be different than how they are. Right, and to me, that resonates on such a deep level, because it's just about acceptance, allowing things to happen and not changing. But when we want things to be different than how they are, that is one of the most futile thought processes, right? Because it's, like you said, it's impossible. But the idea of how do we accept that and how do we move forward? And then going back to how we started the conversation, it's funny. I mean, a little clarification. I actually grew up in Carson, California, which is right next door to Compton. So Carson in the 80s, but very similar. I mean, very similar cultures and everything. But I grew up around, all different types of ethnicities, a lot of Samoan kids, Filipino kids, Black, Latino kids. I was like the one Indian kid. There were a couple of white kids. I was random. But then throughout my journey, like being in like hardcore investment banking, finance, corporate America, I've seen so many different types of men and women, like all social economic levels, ethnicities, races, religions. But there is this universal sense of like meaning and purpose in life. It doesn't matter if you're like in Carson or in Compton and it's like you're struggling, or you may have more toys and different lifestyle if you're like a partner at a banking firm, but the suffering is really, really similar, because they're both like, where's the meaning? Where's the purpose? Right. And so the only reason I bring that up, it's like everything we're talking about, it affects guys at all levels, no matter where they come from, which is why I think it's so important to have this discussion, right? For everyone to have this discussion.
Yeah, I think that we often kind of lose focus on that the suffering is there because something great either once was there or we want to get there. There's a longing for good, and that's the reason why there's the suffering there. I think I spent a lot too much of my 20s and teens in this angsty, resentful state because I didn't want to acknowledge the suffering part.
Yeah.
I wanted all this good and I wanted it to be better. And I had a vision of what that looked like. No idea how I was going to get there, what I was going to do to get there. But I just knew that better was possible, but it wasn't just defined. And I just ran from the suffering so much. And the more that I ran from it, the faster I seemed like I needed to run from it, because it just was always there. Every time you look behind you, the suffering is just there, whatever the trauma or whatever the thing is. And as I got older and started doing therapy and getting coaches and started going to, men's groups and when I went through my bout of sobriety, because, I'm 7 years sober.
Right.
And I think that whole experience was my first introduction into like, holy shit, you can sit in a room full of like-minded men that have the same like idea or vision of better, and we can like talk about real conversations on how to get there and what that looks like and what implementing it looks like and how hard that can be or what that can feel like. And there's a support group there, and I remember talking to again, that older generation, my dad, about when I was going through this. And my dad said, I don't know how you could ever sit in a room full of strangers and pour your heart out and cry, and now I don't know how I could live without that. Because that's how I met JJ. And JJ and I have, we were in these men's groups on how to co-parent better, how to have better relationships with their kids and stepkids and our co-parents, our exes, and these places where a lot of my trauma was and stemmed from, and how I acted in that last relationship and who I was trying to be in this one. And the more that I talked about it, as uncomfortable as it was, and as hard as it was, and as painful as it was, and as much as I suffered through that, the suffering got less, and I got more insightful and clear on what better looked like. And it wasn't just better, it was, no, this is how I want to act when this happens, or this is who I want to be when this arises. And I started really just not saying better, but this is how, and who I want to be, and what I want to be. And I really started getting more clarity to all the ins and outs of that, rather than just trying to run from something that I could never outrun, or pain that I was trying to ignore that would always be there. Now I think through these talks with men like you, Sanjay, and JJ, and in these groups and coaching sessions, the more comfortable I got with that idea of opening up and talking about these things and being open to different strategies and techniques on how to, and questions on how to ask myself about it and think about it and, react to it, the more that it just started seeming like normal. And then, like you're saying earlier in this, it's like, why weren't we taught this in school? Like, these are the two most important things in life, like how to understand oneself and how to interact with the world around us, right? Like, we should be knowing how to be like leaders within our family and our community, and like, how to understand ourselves and our partners and our spouses. Like, what went wrong where we prioritized all these other things, that we got so far away from the thing that needs to be kept, pristine as the foundation, so that all those other things can flourish, like the finances and, the success in whatever field it looks like, and that kind of stuff. But if we don't have an understanding of why we are who we are and how we got there, and what those triggers are and what those behaviors look like and how they express themselves, then nothing can grow.
Yep.
So I'm just, rambling here. I don't know. I think I lost my point halfway
no.
through what I was talking about. But
so you
I
talked
had
about
a way to bring it home at one point, but
you talked about finding the deeper self, taking that deep dive and kind of rejecting the idea that you're going to stay, in the same space that you've been mentally for so long, or you've been taught by older generations. And Sanjay, I'll bring it back to the golf metaphor. We can take a mulligan, or we can blame things on the wind, but that's
Right.
not going to get us to fine tune what we need to fine tune and find our deeper skill set and really kind of, take hold of that. So what does it take to instead blame things on the wind and try to take a mulligan, instead start to work with the wind? How do we take that step? What do those initial steps look like for those men that are wrestling with that, trying to dive deeper into that deeper self?
I mean, accountability is tricky, right? Because with accountability, one, there's vulnerability, but there tends to be a sense of so it's easy to deny it and blame our lives on anyone else, anything else, right? But when we actually sit there and say, I kind of screwed this up, right? I fucked this up. This is my fault. Like there is a sense of shame and a sense of guilt. So confronting that, accepting that, reconciling that is challenging. But also, I think there's an element of self compassion, like saying, yes, I did screw up, but that's okay. I can't do anything about it. What do I do now? Once we have that kind of self compassion, which a lot of guys do not have. I in my website, my coaching process, I have these 6 areas of wellness that I focus on, and one of the 6 areas of wellness is communication. And we think about communication with our partners, with our kids at work. Are we passive aggressive? Are we avoidant? All those types of communication, like working through those and making those healthier. But interestingly, one of the biggest areas of communication that we focus on is the internal communication, like uplifting for their kids and for their spouses, and at work they can be great leaders, but at home they can be so self-critical, never enough, never good enough, not living up to whoever's expectations, always falling short, comparing to every other guy they know and how much they've done or achieved or whatever it might be. We can beat ourselves up so much in our head that we understanding that, stopping that pattern and having more self-compassion, right? And that allows the accountability to happen. And once we have accountability and self-compassion, then we set that foundation to move forward, right? Then we can sit there and go, like, okay, I'm going to do the work. It's not the wind. I had a crappy swing, but that's okay. I can work on my swing. The hammer in that the golf metaphor, but that idea is like I have I have compassion for my clients and for all men who are going through this too, because guilt and shame are really hard. And if they've grown up in an environment where it was really hammered on them, they they're really, really ingrained, that shame is going to be really strong. And it doesn't just go away like that because we say it. It takes time. We have to build, I mean, the neuroscience is there, right? We have to build, new neural pathways. And that happens over time. That's not instantaneous. So it always comes back to like, okay, I have accountability, but that's okay. I have self-compassion. I understand there's guilt and shame there, but I'm moving forward. And I just have to keep doing it and keep working at it. And it's going to take time, right? It's like the river doesn't happen in one day. The river happens over millions of years. In our lifetime, we don't change in one day, but that neural pathway changes over weeks, months, and years. It will change, but it just takes time.
Yeah, I have an instance just last night. I shared this with Colton before we started recording, but my kiddo was he's just been really excited to ride his scooter all over the place, and it's been fun to watch, and see him kind of get better and better every day. And last night I had to take the dogs out, and the sprinkler system was going on, and I said, "All right, buddy, please don't go through the water. We don't want to get wet and dirty." And I took the dogs to a certain location, came back. He was riding right through those sprinklers, just getting wet and dirty. And I'm laughing about it now, right? But at the time, I told him I was disappointed. I had specifically asked him, to avoid that, and he disobeyed me. I think one way that, that could have gone horribly is if I stayed in my upset and told him, despite him saying, "I'm sorry," kept telling him that I was disappointed. And therefore we didn't bring the lesson around and bring everything to an understanding and operating in forgiveness and whatnot. That can just basically drill this idea in his head that, you make mistakes. You are somebody who does not follow through with their word. You are somebody who can't be relied upon. And therefore now you start saying that about yourself. So in childhood, I think, like we were talking about the generations and being stuck in one part of the conversation and not the full picture, like Cohen and I had last night. I think that's where that's kind of bred, and it continues to start to snowball effect in our minds. And then started watching The Lion King, and Simba and his friend, they went to the elephant graveyard, which they weren't supposed to do, and they got in serious danger. And then of course his dad comes in and rescues him, and then tells him, "You've disobeyed me," and there were serious consequences. But then they continue to talk about bravery and overcoming challenges,
Hmm.
and how dads are actually flawed just like their children. And this whole like circle of life thing they were talking about came into play in this one little conversation that I thought was so redemptive and so beautiful, because that's what I want to achieve with my son, so he doesn't have that self talk, which he did say about himself last night, that he's dumb. And I had to reiterate, no, it's not that you're dumb at all. You disobeyed. There was some disrespect in that situation, but we got to talk about it afterward. And I want you to take that piece and move forward with that. I don't want you to take the first part and forget the rest. And I think that's the thing that we see too often, is the guys,
Yeah.
had maybe a certain conversation over time with their parents or something, where the parents were upset and they stayed in the upset. And that's what we take forward. Now I have to be upset at myself because I don't have somebody else constantly giving me feedback. That's the loop that I see too many of us sticking and holding on to.
Yeah. And CJ, I think it's amazing and fantastic that you have the self-awareness and the ability to communicate with your son that way. I think that's awesome. Kudos to you. And that's a huge part of parenting, right? My girls are 17; they're teenage girls. It's like the struggle is real. Crave about it to happen, and but they're also going through their thing. But it's like that's that dance between setting boundaries and then allowing for them to fall and get back up, right? Like having a listening, but knowing that they're going to falter because they're adolescents and they're teenagers, and having compassion. That's that constant daily dance of parenting and why it's so hard.
Yeah, and I think a lot of us get caught, that we just stick the gear into that overdrive mode of like, well, my job is to teach them, so I must reprimand them. I must point out all of the things that they're doing wrong, or, that that I notice is going bad throughout the day. That we just like really, man, that can become so easy to just lock in on that and then create that mentality of, I'm just no good. I always do bad. I'm just, fail all the time. I'm the bad child, and I find myself slipping into that too, and it's same thing with our relationships. You go to your friends and you don't say, oh god, we had such a romantic night, we connected, our intimacy is so profound, like we talked about this and religion. And you go to your friends when you're like, oh, she won't listen, she's always yelling at me, and we got into another fight again because she wants me to pick up the trash. Like, we're always looking to like connect on the negativity that's going on. Misery loves company. We love to like go like, oh, don't you see how hard it is for us? Like, life is so hard. And it's so easy to ingrain that into our kids. And I we really have to be intentional about pointing out the things that we're doing right, not only for our kids, not only for our wives, but for ourselves too. Like, again, I think we really get caught up in the, showing up for the external world in a really great, like, you're doing great, but then you go home and you look in the mirror and you go like, you're such a fucking failure. You should have said this instead of that thing at lunch, oh god, they're going to think you're an idiot. Of course, you know what that is, why did you not put that thing in the email? Oh god, you just start like tearing your every mistake that you made throughout the day, and by the time you're ready to go to bed, you're just exhausted because you've just been shitting on yourself like the whole time. And I think that's really important to how do we rewire those neural pathways, especially in the beginning stages when it feels so hard and so foreign and so insincere to say, you're great, you can do it, keep it up. How do we motivate the repetition of that to get to the stage where we're reaping the benefits 2-3 months later, in these new neural pathways that have been built?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because the neural pathway, I think, metaphor, or not even metaphor, it's the science, is all about repetition. It's about just doing the work. And I think there are a couple like frameworks we think about within that context I think are very helpful in understanding it. I always come back to when my clients talk about skiing. You know, on the same groove, that same path for years, it's so easy to jump in that, right? So you jump in and you just go down, and you do it over and over and over again. You don't even think about it; it becomes subconscious. But when you have stuff like coaching, when you have stuff like meditation I think is phenomenal. Something I think everyone should do, and even if it's for 1 or 2 minutes a day, like that just rewires. It's kind of like throwing new powder on the mountain. So now when we get up to that point, we can choose to go down the old path, but because there's kind of fresh powder and it's a little more flat, we can choose a new path. And the first time we go down it, it's only like a 1/4 inch deep. But then we continue to choose to go down that path. And over time, that groove becomes deeper and deeper and deeper. And it's just literally that's how it works from a physiological perspective. It's just doing it over and over and over again. One thing I wanted to bring up, like this whole concept, this part of this discussion, kind of on the periphery, but I think it's really important to understand. I always come back to my phrase: things are on a spectrum. We're not binary. We have a culture that tends to be very binary. It's very black or white. It is either success or failure. It is either good or bad. There are 2 choices, 2 outcomes. It's dualistic, and that's it. Whereas in life, it's almost never binary. It is a wide spectrum from 0 to 100. Very, very few situations are at 0. Very, very few situations are at 100. We're always somewhere in between. And I think once we start understanding that, that aids the self-compassion, because I'm not at 0, I'm not at 100, but maybe today I'm at 30 or 40, and I would rather be at 70 or 80. And we're always fluctuating somewhere in that spectrum. But when we have a context, it's like, there's either good or bad. I'm either successful or I'm a failure. I'm either this or that. It's really hard. It's hard to live like that because there's no nuance, right? But whereas life is super nuanced.
Yeah, I think it kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier too, of like that little bit of suffering piece, that there's some really kind of gold in the suffering if we're willing to go down the mountain the first few times and make the new path. It's not easy the first time. You're not going fast, you're not enjoying the ride, but you're taking the time to do that, and eventually you do reap the benefits. And I often find, in the periods of my life where I'm coasting and enjoying the same ride over and over again and thinking like, woo, I've got it all figured out. I don't need to think about that stuff anymore. Maybe I don't even need to meditate today because my brain is working so good. Woo, shoot, workout, man, I'm going to just miss that today because I'm just feeling so good, And it's when you start like throwing the hardships, the obstacles out of the way, that you start losing track of like, no, I think that there does maybe need to be a little bit of a balance, a little bit of the gray area. If it's not hard, then what are we striving for? What are we working for? What are we hoping for here? If we're just going to be taking the same path over and over and over again. Have you read the book of Joy? It is
Yeah.
It's a conversation between the Dalai Lama and the Archbishop of Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really good conversations about just like, what joy is. And a lot of the conversations that they have, both, in Christianity and Buddhism, are reared in this aspect of like being aware of that suffering. The pillars of joy, come from acceptance and forgiveness,
Mm-hmm.
patience and gratuity and generosity. A lot of that is not just taking, but it's giving away. It's accepting the world around you. It's forgiving people of past traumas. It's giving a part of yourself away and realizing that we are all the same, no matter if you've got money or this or that. And a lot of those concepts are rooted in the fact that like, once you understand and accept that joy is not just purification of happiness, of gratification, but it is the acceptance of all of the things that brought us to appreciate and be grateful for the moment of joy. And a lot of that is not always easy to look at and hard to trudge through. But once we can accept that and look at that as a whole picture, is when you can experience true joy, an elevated acceptance and awareness of everything.
And it goes, I think that binary part is interesting too, because it's not just joy or sorrow. It's not one state of joy and one state of sorrow, right? It's more, there are different types of joy. Sometimes a joy is a 10 and your is only a 2, but it's still more than 0. It's still joyful. There are nuances and levels even within that. But we were saying, CJ, earlier, it's interesting because we, in mental, spiritual, psychological health and wellness and growth, we kind of don't think about the work that's involved, but we don't do that with almost anything else in life. No one's going to sit there and say, I want a six pack, but I'm not going to work out every day, right? Like, I want to be healthier, but I'm still going to eat the 4,000 calorie meal at Cheesecake Factory or whatever it is, right? Or, sports, obviously, I'm going to work out. But in every other aspect, we get it. If we want this goal, if we want to move forward, I have to do the work, right? But in mental and spiritual and psychological health, going back to the idea of like, okay, am I going to do this repetition? Am I going to get back on the mountain and choose the new path? We just don't think of it the same way. We think it's intuitive. It's more passive. It's going to happen to us, or just happen, it'll manifest on its own.
And then when we don't, and it doesn't, we think, oh, we're just no good. I'm just not
worthy. Or it's
luck.
I'm unfortunate. Skills, this is bad luck. This happened to me. I got a bad draw in life.
Yeah, I love this. Where can our listeners reach out to you, Sanjay, and where can they find more about what you have to say, and your coaching programs and your books? Where can they find you?
Yeah, I mean, for the coaching stuff, it's Sanjay Nambiar Coaching is my website. It has a lot of stuff. My videos are on there. There's a YouTube channel as well. Someone has some of my videos, and then like the kind of outline of the program and like how I approach things. So that's a great place to find stuff.
Yeah. You and I were talking. You said 2 daughters, twins, 17. Is that right? Yeah. So you're a few years ahead of us than where JJ and I are sitting in our course here. But
crazy, man.
I tell you, I got a feisty 9-year-old that's got neurodivergence, and she can argue her way into anything that she wants. And I really, honestly, maybe fear when we're gonna get to that 17-year-old phase, because she's gonna take on the world. There's no telling this girl what to do when she gets to that age, I'll tell you. So you experience any of that right now in your 17? Are they ready to go out there and conquer the world as women, or do they want to live with you forever?
Age, I mean, they're almost adults or young adults, right? It's like it's very roller coaster. There are days when they're going to go conquer the world, and there are days like they just want to be, they just want to cuddle and be taken care of. Like, they're both little kids and they're both young adults, and it fluctuates on a daily basis. And we're hitting the other end of that because they're juniors in high school and they're looking at colleges and stuff, and we're looking at empty nesting like a year and a half. It's nuts. It goes by. One of my favorite sayings for parenting is, the days are long but the years are short, and it's so true. It goes by so fast. So we're trying to appreciate it, and at the same time trying to survive, because it is maddening. It's exhausting. It's all of the above.
Yeah, it is.
I guess, as it should be.
But yeah. Well, thank you so much for doing this, brother. I enjoyed our conversation here, and hope our listeners did too. JJ, you got any other questions or anything else before we kind of wrap things up here?
Well, I honestly wanted to say, congratulations. They are 17 years old, and there's a lot to look forward to. But man, so much has already been laid, in front of them, and you've covered so much ground already. I guess my one question, because they are 17, I have an 8-year-old boy. Also, he has ADHD, and we were talking about binary. He likes to kick that binary can as hard as he can, so it's just splattered everywhere, and it makes multiple colors and stuff. He definitely doesn't allow you to be comfortable in the binary. But I guess my question for you with 17-year-old daughters is like, what are some of the things that you could say with great confidence that you're very proud of, that you've brought them up, and now are gonna send them out into the world? What are some things that you did along the way that you can say, I'm really excited to see what's next based on what we've accomplished here?
I mean, it's any of this with a huge dose of humility, because parents can only do so much. It's about the kids and the work they do and how they're wired and where their journey is. So it's, whatever they do is all about them. As parents, we help guide some of that, and we influence that. But one of the things, like, my wife and I have really focused on, that I think we see it in them, we're really proud of that, is a sense of communication, like being able to communicate with us, communicate within themselves, communicate to each other, communicate to their friends. And I think that is the bedrock of any type of relationship. So being able to have open communication, frequent communication, honest and vulnerable communication. And we see that doing it with their friends. And school, with each other, where it's safe to talk about anything, and it's respectful and it's honored. And so that we see with them, and we're hoping, we anticipated they'll be able to carry that into college and into their adulthood. It's kind of just the way they are now. Like, we're really proud of them for being that way. Letting them know we can't, like, if someone told me when I was studying econ and neurobio in college at Berkeley that I would be doing all this creative work and being a men's coach when I'm 50, I'd be like, that doesn't make any sense, right? I'm on a totally different path. Like, we can't anticipate what life is going to give us. And we're letting them know now. It's like, yeah, you can plan your life. Your generation's totally different too. Like, their generation, I think, they'll have 10 jobs by the time they're 30. It's not linear like ours. But nonetheless, it's like allowing the path to happen, like continuing to do the work, but also realizing no matter, like, our best laid plans, most likely aren't going to happen. And that's okay. That is okay. It doesn't mean you stop planning, but allowing the evolution to happen, allowing the journey to happen, allowing transformation to happen. And like, we're showing them that, we're teaching them that. And I think they get that. So it's like, yeah, life is exciting, but it's like, it's going to go in ways you can't, anticipate, but just being ready for that when it happens.
Well said, brother. Love that. And don't worry, guys, we're going to have links to all of Sanjay's stuff, the kids' books and the books that we talked about, and the links to his website, too. So if you do want to reach out to him and get some of his goods, please do so. And please leave us a review on the podcast platform. That's the best way to support us in this show and what we do, because we want to keep the momentum going and have great guests like Sanjay on, keep informing you guys on how we can take this to the next step. So thank you, Sanjay. Thank you, JJ. And thank you guys for listening. This has been another episode of the ADH Dads. I'm your host, CJ.
I'm JJ.
Thank you, CJ and JJ. You guys are awesome.
Thank you, brother.
It was an honor to be on.
All right. And we'll see you next time, guys.